The thunder cracked in the distance as Faith O'Sullivan watched the storm clouds gather, knowing she'd made a terrible mistake by insisting on taking the shortcut back to town. At 22, she was old enough to know better than to ignore the warning signs of a prairie storm, yet her stubborn determination to prove herself in this new life out west had once again gotten the better of her judgment. The year was 1878, and Montana Territory was unforgiving to those who underestimated its unpredictable nature. Faith pulled her thin cotton shawl tighter around her shoulders, a useless gesture against the rapidly cooling air. The first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering against her face and soaking into her already dusty riding skirt. She had left her employer's homestead after delivering medicine from the town pharmacy, assuring Mrs. Henderson that she would be back in Pinecrest well before dark. Now, as the sky darkened prematurely with the approaching storm, Faith realized how foolish her confidence had been. Her horse, a gentle mare named Clover, huffed nervously and shifted beneath her as lightning split the sky again. The plains stretched endlessly around her, the distant mountains now obscured by sheets of rain sweeping across the landscape. Faith was at least 10 miles from town, with nothing but rolling prairie between her and shelter. "It's all right, girl," Faith murmured, patting Clover's neck with a trembling hand. "We'll find somewhere to wait it out." The rain began in earnest then, a sudden downpour that seemed to appear from nowhere. Within seconds, Faith's clothes were plastered to her skin, her auburn hair escaping its pins and hanging in dripping tendrils. She urged Clover forward, squinting through the rain for any sign of shelter. A homestead, a barn, even a cluster of trees would do. The thunder boomed overhead, and Clover reared slightly, nearly unseating Faith, who clung desperately to the saddle horn. "Steady now!" she called over the roar of the storm. It was then that she heard it, the rhythmic pounding of hooves approaching from behind. Faith turned in her saddle, her heart racing with equal parts hope and fear. Strangers on the frontier could mean rescue or danger, and a woman alone had every reason to be cautious. Through the curtain of rain, she made out the silhouette of a rider on horseback, moving purposefully toward her. As the figure drew closer, she could see it was a man atop a powerful black stallion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low over his face, and a long duster that whipped about in the wind. "Miss!" he called out, his deep voice carrying over the storm as he pulled alongside her. "You shouldn't be out in this. There's a flash flood coming down from the mountains." Faith stared at the stranger, taking in his strong jawline and the concerned look in his piercing blue eyes. "I was trying to get back to town," she shouted back, having to raise her voice over another crash of thunder. "Town's too far in this weather," he replied, glancing at the darkening sky. "My ranch is just over that rise. I can offer you shelter until the storm passes." Faith hesitated. Her mother's warnings about strange men echoed in her mind, but the alternative was braving the storm alone. Another flash of lightning decided for her, as Clover neighed in fright. "Lead the way," Faith agreed, nodding gratefully. "Name's Preston Wade," he said, tipping his hat slightly despite the rain streaming off its brim. "Follow close behind me. The path gets tricky when it's washed out." Preston Wade turned his horse, and Faith followed, hunched against the driving rain. They rode in silence save for the occasional direction he called back to her. The rain was relentless, but there was something comforting about following this stranger's broad-shouldered form as he guided her confidently through the storm. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes of hard riding, a structure emerged through the gray curtain of rain, a sturdy log ranch house with a wide covered porch and a large barn nearby. "We'll get the horses settled first," Preston called to her as they approached the barn, "then get you somewhere dry." Faith nodded, relief washing over her at the sight of shelter. Preston dismounted with easy grace and came to help her down from her saddle. His hands were strong and sure around her waist as he lifted her to the ground. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Faith felt an unexpected flutter in her chest before quickly looking away. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses. Preston moved efficiently, removing saddles and bridles, wiping down the rain-soaked animals, and providing them with feed. Faith tried to help, but her fingers were numb with cold, and she fumbled with Clover's tack. "Here, let me," Preston said, gently taking over the task. "You're shaking like a leaf." "I'm sorry to be such a burden," Faith said, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to stop trembling. Preston glanced at her, his expression softening. "No burden at all, Miss—" "O'Sullivan," she supplied. "Faith O'Sullivan. Miss O'Sullivan," he nodded. "It's no burden to help someone in need. That's just the way things are done out here." Once the horses were settled, Preston led Faith across the muddy yard to the main house, both of them running through the downpour. The porch provided blessed relief from the rain, and Preston quickly opened the door, ushering Faith inside. The interior was surprisingly welcoming. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with comfortable-looking furniture arranged before it. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that suggested their owner was a man of some education. "Let me get that fire going," Preston said, moving to the hearth where kindling and logs were already laid. "You'll need to get out of those wet clothes. I might have something that would fit you, though it'll be far too large." Faith blushed at the impropriety of the situation, but knew he was right. Her teeth had begun to chatter, and her soaked dress felt like ice against her skin. I would appreciate that," she managed. Preston lit the fire with practiced ease, and soon flames were crackling merrily in the hearth. He disappeared into what Faith assumed was a bedroom, returning moments later with a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. "These are the smallest I have," he said apologetically, placing them in her hands. "There's a screen in the corner you can change behind. I'll make some coffee to warm you up." Faith clutched the dry clothes gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Wade." "Preston," he corrected with a small smile. "We don't stand on ceremony much out here." Faith nodded and retreated behind the decorative screen in the corner of the room. She peeled off her sodden dress and petticoats with difficulty, hanging them over the top of the screen in hopes they might dry somewhat. The borrowed clothes were indeed enormous on her slender frame, but they were blissfully dry and warm. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs as best she could and cinched the waist of the trousers with a piece of cord she found in the pocket. When Faith emerged, Preston had his back to her, tending to a pot of coffee on the stove. He had removed his duster and hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He'd also changed into dry clothes, a simple blue shirt and dark trousers. He turned at the sound of her approach, and Faith saw amusement flicker in his eyes at the sight of her swimming in his clothes. But there was something else there, too, a brief, appreciative glance that he quickly masked. "Those are a sight better than your wet things," he commented, pouring coffee into 2 enamel mugs. "Come sit by the fire. Storm's settling in for a while from the sound of it." Faith accepted the steaming mug he offered and settled into a chair near the hearth, grateful for the warmth spreading from the fire. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. "I'm grateful for your help," Faith said, wrapping her fingers around the warm mug. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Preston took a seat across from her. "What were you doing out there alone, if you don't mind my asking? It's not safe for anyone to be caught in that kind of weather, especially not a woman on her own." Faith sipped her coffee before answering. "I work for the pharmacist in town, Mr. Dawson. I was delivering medicine to the Henderson place and thought I could make it back before the storm hit." She shook her head ruefully. "I should have known better. I've only been in Montana for 6 months, but that's long enough to know how quickly the weather changes." 6 months? Preston raised an eyebrow. "Where were you before that?" "Boston," Faith replied. "My parents died of influenza last year. After settling their affairs, there was little left for me there. My father's sister lives in Pinecrest, so I came west to start anew." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "That takes courage. Not many Easterners adapt well to life out here." Faith smiled slightly. "I'm learning, though today's adventure suggests I still have much to learn." "We all make mistakes," Preston said, his eyes warm with understanding. "I've lived here all my life and still get caught out sometimes." "Is this your family's ranch?" Faith asked, looking around the comfortable room. A shadow crossed Preston's face. "It was my father's. He died 3 years ago. My mother passed when I was young." "I'm sorry," Faith said softly, recognizing the familiar pain of loss in his expression. "Thank you." Preston stared into the fire for a moment. "It's a good piece of land. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's mine, and I've worked hard to keep it that way." Faith studied him as he gazed into the flames. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and those striking blue eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and sorrow. She guessed him to be in his late 20s, his face weathered from a life spent outdoors. "Do you run it alone?" she asked. "I have 2 ranch hands," Preston explained. "Brothers, the Millers, good men. They're up at the north pasture checking on the herd. They'll likely stay in the line shack until this weather clears." They lapsed into comfortable silence, listening to the rain and the crackling fire. Faith found her eyelids growing heavy, the warmth and the emotional drain of her ordeal catching up with her. "You should rest," Preston said gently, noticing her exhaustion. "You can take my bed. I'll sleep out here." Faith started to protest, but Preston raised a hand. "I insist. It's no hardship. I've slept in far worse places than my own hearth." Too tired to argue, Faith allowed Preston to show her to his bedroom, a simple but neat space with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt. "Thank you," she said, pausing in the doorway. "For everything." Preston nodded. "Sleep well, Miss O'Sullivan. The storm should pass by morning." Faith closed the door softly behind her and sank onto the edge of the bed. The events of the day swirled in her mind, the terror of being caught in the storm, the relief at Preston's timely arrival, and the strange sense of comfort she felt in this stranger's home. As she lay down, surrounded by the faint scent of pine and leather that seemed to be Preston's own, Faith wondered what kind of man he truly was, this solitary rancher who had ridden out in a storm to help a stranger. Sleep claimed her quickly, the steady drumming of rain on the roof a lullaby that carried her into dreams. Faith woke to sunlight, streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, noting that her clothes had been placed, now dry, on a chair near the bed. Preston must have retrieved them from the screen while she slept. After changing back into her own dress, grateful to be properly attired again, Faith smoothed her hair as best she could and ventured out to the main room. Preston stood at the stove, his back to her, as he tended to something that smelled deliciously like bacon. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, a smile lighting his face. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd sleep the day away." Faith flushed, glancing at the window where bright sunshine indicated it was well into the morning. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize how tired I was." "No need to apologize," Preston assured her. "After what you went through, you needed the rest. Hungry?" At his question, Faith's stomach rumbled audibly, causing them both to laugh. "Apparently so," she admitted. "Good timing, then. Breakfast is just ready." They sat at a small table by the kitchen window, sharing a hearty meal of bacon, eggs, and biscuits. Outside, the world was washed clean by the storm, the prairie grasses glistening with raindrops in the morning light. "The creek will be high after all that rain," Preston commented, pouring Faith more coffee. "But the main road to town should be passable by midday." Faith nodded, feeling a curious reluctance at the thought of leaving. "I should get back as soon as possible. My aunt will be worried, and Mr. Dawson will need me at the pharmacy." "Of course," Preston agreed. "I'll ride with you to town. These parts can be dangerous for a woman alone, especially after a storm, when outlaws know travelers might be forced onto unfamiliar paths." "You've already done so much," Faith protested. "I couldn't ask you to take more time away from your work." Preston's eyes met hers across the table. "You didn't ask. I offered. Besides, I need to pick up supplies in town anyway." There was something in his steady gaze that made Faith's heart beat a little faster. She looked down at her plate, suddenly flustered. "Then I gratefully accept your escort, Mr. Wade." "Preston," he reminded her with a smile. "And you're welcome, Faith." The casual use of her given name sent a pleasant shiver through her that she tried to ignore. After breakfast, Preston helped Faith saddle Clover, his hands working efficiently as he checked the cinches and bridle. His own horse, the powerful black stallion she'd seen yesterday, stood patiently nearby. "That's a magnificent animal," Faith commented, admiring the stallion's gleaming coat. Preston patted the horse's neck affectionately. "This is Midnight. Raised him from a colt. Best horse I've ever had." Once they were mounted, Preston led the way down a muddy trail that wound through stands of pine before connecting to the main road to Pinecrest. The morning air was fresh and cool after the storm, filled with the scent of wet earth and pine. Birds called from the trees, and twice they startled deer that bounded gracefully away through the underbrush. They rode side by side, where the trail allowed, talking easily about life in Montana territory. Faith found herself telling Preston about her childhood in Boston, her father's work as a professor of literature, and her mother's passion for social causes. In turn, Preston spoke of growing up on the ranch, learning ranching from his father, and his dreams of expanding his herd. "Did you ever consider a different life?" Faith asked as they paused to let their horses drink from a clear stream. "Something away from ranching?" Preston was quiet for a moment, watching the water ripple around Midnight's fetlocks. "I went east for schooling when I was younger. My father insisted I get an education beyond what the local schoolhouse could provide." He smiled slightly at the memory. "I spent 4 years in St. Louis. Even thought about staying, becoming a lawyer perhaps." "What changed your mind?" "My father fell ill," Preston said simply. "I came home to help with the ranch and never left. And truthfully, I found I missed this life more than I expected. There's something about the open country, the changing seasons, even the hardships. It gets in your blood." Faith nodded, understanding. Though she'd been in Montana only a short time, she'd already begun to feel the pull of this wild, beautiful land. The vastness of the sky, the drama of the weather, the sense of possibility that seemed to stretch as far as the horizon. It was intoxicating in its way. As they continued their journey, the town of Pinecrest came into view, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street, with houses scattered on the outskirts. It wasn't much compared to Boston, but Faith had come to think of it as home. "My aunt's house is on the edge of town," Faith directed as they approached. "The white one, with the blue trim." As they neared the house, the front door flew open, and a plump woman in her 50s rushed out, her face a mixture of relief and worry. "Faith O'Sullivan!" she called out. "Where on earth have you been? I've been sick with worry." Faith dismounted quickly, moving to embrace her aunt. "I'm so sorry, Aunt Harriet. I got caught in the storm yesterday and couldn't make it back to town." Harriet O'Sullivan hugged her niece tightly before pulling back to examine her. "Are you all right? You're not hurt?" "I'm fine, truly," Faith assured her. "Thanks to Mr. Wade." She gestured toward Preston, who had dismounted and was standing respectfully nearby, hat in hand. Harriet turned her attention to the tall rancher. "You helped my niece?" "Yes, madam," Preston replied. "Found her caught in the downpour and offered shelter at my ranch until the storm passed." Harriet's expression softened. "Then I owe you my deepest gratitude, Mr. Wade. Please, won't you come in for some tea? It's the least I can offer?" Preston glanced at Faith, who smiled encouragingly. "I'd be honored, Mrs. O'Sullivan." "It's Miss, actually," Harriet corrected with a small smile. "But please call me Harriet. Any man who helps my niece is welcome in my home." They tied their horses to the hitching post, and Harriet led them into a cozy parlor while she went to prepare tea. Faith felt suddenly self-conscious, aware of her rumpled appearance and the impropriety of having spent the night at Preston's home, however innocent the circumstances. "Your aunt seems like a kind woman," Preston commented, looking around at the neat, comfortable room with its feminine touches, embroidered pillows, delicate figurines, and framed needlework on the walls. "She is," Faith agreed. "She's been wonderful to me since I arrived. I don't know what I would have done without her." Harriet returned with a tea tray, and as they sipped their tea, Faith recounted the events of the previous day. Her aunt listened with growing alarm, clutching her handkerchief to her chest at the most dramatic moments. "My goodness," Harriet exclaimed when Faith finished. "You could have been killed. Those flash floods are no joke. The Hendersons' neighbor lost 2 children to one 3 years ago." Faith paled at the thought. "I had no idea it was so dangerous. I should have waited at the Hendersons when I saw the storm coming." "Hindsight makes us all wiser," Preston said gently. "The important thing is, you're safe now." Harriet studied Preston over the rim of her teacup. "You have a ranch near here, Mr. Wade? I don't believe we've met before." "The Circle W, about 15 miles southwest of town," Preston explained. "I don't get into Pinecrest very often. Usually send my ranch hands for supplies." "Ah, the old Wade place," Harriet nodded. "I remember your father. He was always kind when I visited my brother years ago." She glanced at Faith. "Your uncle used to doctor the Wade cattle before he passed." The connection surprised Faith. You knew Preston's family? This is a small community, dear, Harriet reminded her. Everyone knows everyone, or at least of them. She turned back to Preston. Your father was a good man. I was sorry to hear of his passing. Thank you, madam, Preston replied, a shadow crossing his features. They finished their tea, and Preston rose to take his leave. I should get to the mercantile before heading back. Got a list of supplies to fetch. Faith walked with him to the door, feeling strangely reluctant to see him go. At the threshold, Preston paused, turning to face her. Thank you again for your hospitality, Faith said softly, and for saving me from my own foolishness. Preston smiled, his blue eyes warm. It was my pleasure, Miss O'Sullivan. He hesitated, then added, Perhaps I might call on you sometime. When I'm next in town? Faith felt her cheeks warm. I would like that very much. He nodded, seeming pleased. Until then. Faith watched from the doorway as Preston mounted Midnight and rode toward the center of town, his broad shoulders straight, his posture confident in the saddle. Only when he disappeared around a corner did she close the door and turn to find her aunt watching her with a knowing smile. Well, Harriet said, gathering the tea things, he seems like a fine young man. Faith busied herself helping with the cups to hide her blush. He was very kind. And handsome, Harriet added with a twinkle in her eye. With a good reputation, from what I recall, hard-working, honest. Aunt Harriet, Faith protested, though she couldn't help smiling. What? A woman my age can notice these things. Harriet winked. And it wouldn't hurt you to consider a man like that. Montana needs good women to make homes and families. It's how civilization takes root in wild places. Faith shook her head, amused by her aunt's transparent matchmaking. But as she went to change into fresh clothes, she found herself thinking of Preston's invitation to call on her, and the prospect filled her with a quiet anticipation she hadn't felt in a very long time. The next few weeks passed quickly for Faith. She resumed her work at Dawson's pharmacy, mixing remedies, keeping the ledgers, and helping customers. Word of her adventure in the storm spread through town, as all news did in Pinecrest, and she endured good-natured teasing and concern in equal measure. You're lucky Wade found you, Mr. Dawson told her one afternoon as they worked side by side, preparing a tonic for Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism. The pharmacist was a thin, scholarly man in his 60s, who had taken Faith under his wing, teaching her the properties of various herbs and compounds. He's one of the good ones, not like some in these parts. Faith carefully measured oil of wintergreen into the mixture. Everyone speaks well of him. With good reason, Dawson nodded. His father built that ranch from nothing, and Preston's made it even better. Treats his men fair, pays his debts on time. That's more than can be said for many. Faith had heard similar comments from others in town. Preston Wade was respected, a man of his word. It only deepened her interest in him. True to his word, Preston came to call on Faith the following Sunday. He arrived at Harriet's door in the early afternoon, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his Sunday best, a clean dark suit, white shirt, and string tie. He'd even trimmed his beard, Faith noticed, and his dark hair was neatly combed. Miss O'Sullivan, he greeted her formally when she opened the door. I hope I find you well. Faith couldn't help smiling at his formality. Very well, thank you, Mr. Wade. Won't you come in? Harriet made herself scarce after the initial greetings, retreating to her room with some mending and leaving the parlor door conspicuously open, as propriety demanded. Their conversation started somewhat stiffly, but soon warmed as they discovered shared interests, books they had both read, a mutual appreciation for music, and a similar outlook on the development of the territory. Most folks just see the land as something to use up, Preston said, his passion evident. Cut down all the trees, hunt all the game, graze cattle until there's nothing left but dust. But it doesn't have to be that way. Faith nodded, understanding. My father used to say that true progress means finding balance, taking only what we need, and ensuring there's enough left for the future. Exactly, Preston agreed, his eyes lighting up. That's why I rotate my grazing lands, plant trees where they've been cut, make sure my men don't overhunt. Some of the other ranchers laugh at me for it. But my father taught me that we're borrowing this land from our children, not inheriting it from our parents. Faith found herself charmed by his conviction and the thoughtfulness behind it. It was rare to find such forward thinking in anyone, let alone a frontier rancher. Before Preston left, he asked if Faith might accompany him to the town's upcoming Founders' Day celebration the following weekend. "There'll be a picnic, dancing," he explained, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "It's not much compared to city entertainments, I'm sure, but—" "I'd be delighted," Faith interrupted, saving him from his uncertainty. His smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I'll call for you at noon on Saturday, then." After he left, Harriet emerged from her room, trying and failing to hide her satisfaction. "He seems very taken with you," she observed casually. Faith pretended to be absorbed in her needlework. "He's just being kind." Harriet hummed skeptically. "Men don't put on their Sunday suits and ride 15 miles to town on their day of rest just to be kind, my dear." Faith couldn't quite suppress her smile at that observation. The Founders' Day celebration exceeded Faith's expectations. The entire town gathered in the meadow beside the church, where tables groaned with food brought by every family. Children ran and played games, men engaged in good-natured competitions of strength and skill, and a small band of local musicians provided lively tunes for dancing on a wooden platform erected for the occasion. Preston arrived promptly at noon to escort Faith and Harriet, looking handsome in his best clothes, with a freshly polished saddle on midnight. He'd brought a gentle mare for Faith to ride, and offered his wagon for Harriet, who declared herself too old for horseback, but too young to miss a celebration. Throughout the afternoon, Preston was attentive without being overbearing. He introduced Faith to people she hadn't yet met, made sure she always had refreshments, and stood proudly at her side during conversations. When the dancing began, he hesitantly offered his hand. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer," he confessed as he led her to the platform. "We don't get much practice out at the ranch." Faith smiled up at him. "Just follow the music. I'll help you." His hand was warm and strong around hers, his other hand respectfully at her waist as they joined the other couples. Preston moved somewhat stiffly at first, clearly concentrating on the steps, but soon relaxed into the rhythm. By the third dance, he was guiding Faith confidently around the floor, both of them laughing when they occasionally misstepped. During a break in the dancing, they walked to the edge of the meadow, where wildflowers bloomed in profusion and the view stretched to the distant mountains. "It's beautiful here," Faith said, breathing in the clean air scented with pine and meadow grass. Preston looked at her rather than the view. "Yes, it is." Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks at his obvious meaning. She changed the subject, asking about his ranch and his plans for it. "I'm hoping to buy the adjacent property," Preston explained. "Old man Jenkins is looking to sell. His sons went east and aren't coming back. With that land, I could expand my herd considerably." "That sounds wonderful," Faith said sincerely. "From what everyone says, you've made quite a success of the Circle W already." Preston shrugged modestly. "I've been fortunate, and I learned from the best." He paused, then added more softly, "Sometimes I wish my father could see it now. He always believed it could be something special." "I'm sure he would be proud," Faith said, touched by the emotion in his voice. Preston met her eyes. "Thank you for saying that." After a moment, he cleared his throat. "What about you? Do you plan to stay in Pinecrest?" The question caught Faith by surprise. "I haven't thought much beyond the present," she admitted. "When I came west, I was simply looking for a new start after losing my parents. But I've grown fond of this place." "I'm glad to hear that," Preston said, his voice warm. "The territory needs people like you, people who appreciate its beauty and potential." They were interrupted by the call to supper, but throughout the evening meal and the festivities that followed, Faith found herself increasingly aware of Preston's presence beside her, of the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, and of her own growing feelings for this thoughtful, steady man. As the celebration wound down and lanterns were lit against the gathering dusk, Preston and Faith found themselves once more at the edge of the meadow, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. "I've had a wonderful time today," Faith said softly. Preston turned to face her. "So have I." He hesitated, then continued. "Faith, I know we haven't known each other long, but I'd like to continue calling on you, if you're amenable." Faith's heart quickened. "I would like that very much." In the lantern light, she could see relief and happiness spread across his features. "Good," he said simply. Then, gathering his courage, he leaned down and placed a gentle, brief kiss on her cheek. Very good indeed. The kiss was chaste, proper even, but Faith felt it like a spark that warmed her from within. As they walked back to where Harriet waited by the wagon, Faith knew that something significant had begun, something that had started with a rainstorm and a chance encounter on the open prairie. Over the next several months, Preston became a regular visitor to Pinecrest. He made the journey every Sunday without fail, sometimes staying only for afternoon tea, other times joining Faith and Harriet for dinner. On special occasions, he would arrive on Saturday and escort Faith to whatever social event the small town had organized, a barn dance, a church social, or a community picnic. Each visit deepened their connection. Faith came to admire Preston's quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, and the gentle way he treated everyone, from the town banker to the orphaned children at the small school. For his part, Preston was captivated by Faith's intelligence, her adaptability to frontier life, and the grace with which she handled both the joys and hardships of their developing relationship. It wasn't all smooth sailing. The distance between town and the Circle W meant their time together was limited, and the harsh Montana winter made travel difficult and sometimes dangerous. There were weeks when roads were impassable, and Faith would worry until Preston's next letter arrived via the mail carrier who braved the snow-covered trails. There were also cultural adjustments for Faith. The refined Boston society she'd grown up in had little in common with the rough-hewn frontier community. Certain comforts and conveniences she'd taken for granted were simply unavailable, and the blunt speech and manners of some townsfolk still occasionally shocked her. But each challenge only strengthened her resolve. Faith found herself learning new skills: how to preserve food for winter, how to make soap from scratch, how to tend a kitchen garden that would supplement their diets when fresh supplies were scarce. Harriet was a patient teacher, and Faith was an eager student. Preston, too, faced adjustments. Accustomed to the solitary life of a rancher, he had to learn the art of courtship, of expressing his feelings in words rather than just actions. He became more conscious of his appearance, taking greater care with his clothing and grooming when he knew he would see Faith. He even asked Harriet for advice on which books Faith might enjoy, showing up one Sunday with a volume of poetry that had been difficult to obtain, but which he knew Faith had mentioned missing. As spring arrived, bringing with it new growth and longer days, Preston invited Faith to visit the Circle W. "I'd like you to see the ranch," he told her, as they walked through Pinecrest after church one Sunday. "To understand what my life is like there." Faith was eager to accept. "I'd love that. When?" "Next Saturday. I'll come fetch you and your aunt in the wagon. It's a fair distance, but the roads are good now that the mud has dried." The following Saturday dawned clear and mild. Preston arrived early, the wagon freshly painted and lined with clean blankets for comfort. Harriet insisted on bringing a picnic basket filled with her special fried chicken and berry pie, despite Preston's assurances that his cook, Mrs. Gunderson, would provide a fine meal. The journey to the Circle W took nearly 3 hours, but the time passed quickly as Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's history. Faith was struck by how deeply he knew this land. Every creek and hill, every stand of trees seemed to have a name and a story in his memory. As they crested a rise, the ranch came into view below them, more extensive than Faith had realized from her brief stay during the storm. The main house sat nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills, with the barn and outbuildings arranged nearby. Beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and in the distance a creek wound like a silver ribbon through the property. "It's beautiful," Faith breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Preston's face showed pride and pleasure at her reaction. "It's home." He guided the wagon down the gentle slope toward the ranch buildings. As they approached, 2 men emerged from the barn, the Miller brothers Preston had mentioned, Faith assumed. "This here's Daniel and Joseph Miller," Preston confirmed, introducing the brothers once they'd stopped the wagon. "Best ranch hands in the territory. This is Miss Faith O'Sullivan and her aunt, Miss Harriet O'Sullivan." The brothers tipped their hats respectfully, though Faith caught the curious glances they exchanged. Clearly, Preston bringing a young woman to the ranch was significant. Mrs. Gunderson, the cook and housekeeper, greeted them at the door, a stout Norwegian woman with a no-nonsense manner but kind eyes. She had prepared a welcome that made Harriet's picnic unnecessary, though they assured her they would enjoy it for supper. Preston gave them a tour of the ranch house, which Faith saw now in daylight for the first time. It was larger than she'd realized that stormy night, with a spacious kitchen, dining room, and sitting room downstairs, and several bedrooms upstairs. The furnishings were solid and practical rather than fashionable, but there were touches that spoke of care and permanence, framed landscapes on the walls, well-tended houseplants in the windows, a piano in the corner of the sitting room that Preston admitted had been his mother's. After lunch, Preston showed Faith the rest of the ranch, the barn, with its stalls for horses and storage for hay, the bunkhouse where the Miller brothers and occasional seasonal workers stayed, the smokehouse, the workshop, and the corrals where young calves frolicked under the watchful eyes of their mothers. "And this," Preston said, leading Faith to a fenced garden behind the house, "is my mother's garden. Mrs. Gunderson keeps it up now, but my mother started it. She said every proper home needs flowers as well as vegetables." The garden was coming into bloom, with early spring flowers adding color to the practical rows of vegetable plants. Faith knelt to examine a cluster of pansies. She had good taste. "These are lovely. She would have liked you," Preston said quietly. Faith looked up at him, touched by the simple statement. "I wish I could have known her." "So do I." Preston offered his hand to help Faith up, and for a moment they stood close together, his hand still holding hers. "Faith, He was interrupted by Mrs. Gunderson calling from the house that coffee was ready. The moment broke, but Faith carried the warmth of it with her as they returned to the house. They spent the remainder of the afternoon pleasantly, with Preston showing Faith his small library of books, and Harriet and Mrs. Gunderson discovering a shared interest in quilting patterns. As the sun began to lower toward the western hills, Preston suggested a short ride to his favorite spot on the property. "It's not far," he assured Harriet. "We'll be back well before dark." Harriet waved them off with a knowing smile. "Take your time. Mrs. Gunderson is showing me her recipe for lefse. It could be hours before we're done." Preston helped Faith mount a gentle mare, then swung up onto Midnight. They rode at an easy pace along a well-worn trail that followed the creek upstream, eventually climbing a small rise that offered a panoramic view of the ranch and the surrounding country. Preston dismounted and helped Faith down, tethering the horses to a nearby tree. A large flat rock provided a natural bench, and they sat side by side, taking in the vista before them. "I come here to think sometimes," Preston said, "or just to remind myself how fortunate I am to call this place home." The view was indeed spectacular, the ranch buildings below, the creek winding through green pastures, the distant mountains touched with the gold of late afternoon sun. Faith understood why it was special to him. "Thank you for showing me your home," she said softly. "It helps me understand you better." Preston turned to look at her, his expression suddenly serious. "Faith, there's something I've been wanting to say to you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes? These past months, getting to know you, they've been the happiest of my life." He took her hand in his. "I never expected to find someone like you, someone who understands both the world I came from and the one I've chosen. Someone who sees this land the way I do, as something to cherish rather than just use." Faith felt tears pricking at her eyes at the emotion in his voice. "What I'm trying to say," Preston continued, "is that I've fallen in love with you, Faith O'Sullivan, deeply and completely, and while I know it might be too soon, I can't imagine my life without you in it." Faith's breath caught. Though she had begun to hope, to suspect his feelings matched her own, hearing the words spoken aloud made her heart soar. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "Not when it's right." Preston's eyes searched hers. "Then you feel the same?" "I do," Faith confessed. "I love you too, Preston Wade, more than I thought possible." The joy that spread across his features was like sunshine. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Preston leaned forward and kissed her a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of reverence and promise. Faith returned the kiss, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. When they finally drew apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I want to ask you properly, with a ring and on bended knee, but I needed to know first if you might one day want to be my wife." Faith's eyes shimmered with happy tears. "Ask me, Preston. Ask me now." Surprise and delight flashed across his face. Then, without hesitation, he slid from the rock to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. "Faith O'Sullivan, would you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife? Of making a life with me here on the Circle W? I promise to love you, cherish you, and stand beside you through whatever joys and challenges life brings us." Faith could barely speak through her emotion. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, Preston, I will marry you." He rose and gathered her into his arms, kissing her with more passion now. A kiss that spoke of their shared future and the love that had grown between them since that stormy day when fate had brought them together. As they rode back to the ranch house, the setting sun painting the landscape in hues of gold and rose, Faith felt a deep contentment settle in her soul. The journey that had brought her west had been marked by loss and uncertainty, but it had led her to this, to Preston, to the Circle W, to a love and a future she could never have imagined when she boarded that train in Boston less than a year ago. Harriet and Mrs. Gunderson's knowing smiles when they returned suggested the women had guessed what might happen on that ride. Preston formally asked Harriet for her blessing, which she gave wholeheartedly, embracing them both with tears in her eyes. "Your parents would be so happy for you," she told Faith. "They would approve of Preston, I'm certain of it." That night, as they journeyed back to town under a canopy of stars, Faith nestled against Preston in the wagon, Harriet dozing on the seat across from them. The future stretched before them, full of promise. "When shall we be married?" Preston asked softly, his arm around her shoulders. Faith considered. "Not too long. Perhaps when the wildflowers are in full bloom. 6 weeks from now?" 6 weeks, Preston agreed. "Just enough time for me to build that addition to the house I've been planning. A proper study for you, with bookshelves and a writing desk by the window." Faith looked up at him, touched by his thoughtfulness. "You've been planning this?" Preston smiled somewhat sheepishly. "Hoping, at least. Since the Founders' Day dance, I've been making preparations, just in case you said yes." Faith laughed softly and pressed closer to his side. "I can't imagine having said anything else." The next 6 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Faith divided her time between her work at the pharmacy and getting ready for her new life as Mrs. Preston Wade. Harriet helped her sew a wedding dress of ivory satin, ordered specially from the Mercantile, while the women of Pinecrest organized a quilting bee to create a wedding quilt as a gift for the couple. Preston threw himself into preparing the ranch, building the promised study for Faith, and freshening the main bedroom with new wallpaper and curtains. Mrs. Gunderson, delighted that her employer was finally marrying, supervised a thorough cleaning of the entire house and began teaching the Miller brothers to mind their language and manners in anticipation of having a lady in residence. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the third Saturday in May. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows around Pinecrest, just as Faith had hoped. The ceremony was held in the small white church at the edge of town, with Reverend Johnson officiating. Harriet gave the bride away, and Daniel Miller stood as Preston's best man. Faith would forever remember the look on Preston's face as she walked down the aisle toward him, a mixture of awe, joy, and steadfast love that made her heart full to bursting. His voice was strong and sure as he spoke his vows, promising to love and honor her all the days of his life. The entire town turned out for the celebration that followed, held in the meadow where they had danced at the Founders' Day celebration. Tables groaned with food contributed by every family in Pinecrest, and the same small band played for dancing that continued well into the evening. As twilight fell, Preston and Faith slipped away from the festivities, climbing into the wagon he had prepared for their journey home to the Circle W, which was now Faith's home as well. Harriet would follow in a few days, moving into the small guest cabin Preston had refurbished for her at the edge of the ranch yard, close enough for frequent visits, but far enough to give the newlyweds privacy. The journey to the ranch that evening was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts and the significance of the day. When they crested the rise that offered the first view of the Circle W, Preston stopped the wagon. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wade," he said softly, taking her hand in his. Faith looked out over the peaceful scene below, the ranch buildings outlined against the darkening sky, a light burning welcomingly in the main house window where Mrs. Gunderson had left a lamp for them. "Home," Faith repeated, the word filling her with warmth. She turned to her husband, and smiled. "It sounds perfect." Preston leaned over and kissed her tenderly. "It will be, with you beside me." As they continued down the slope toward their new life together, Faith reflected on how far she had come from that frightened young woman caught in a rainstorm less than a year ago. The path that had seemed so uncertain then had led her to this moment, to this man, to this place that already felt like where she was meant to be. The wagon rolled to a stop before the house, and Preston jumped down, coming around to lift Faith from her seat. But instead of setting her down, he cradled her in his arms. "Mrs. Gunderson would be scandalized if I didn't carry my bride over the threshold," he explained with a twinkle in his eye. Faith laughed and wrapped her arms around his neck as he carried her up the steps and through the front door into their home, their future together. 1 year later, Faith stood on the porch of the Circle W, watching as Preston rode in from the north pasture. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, where their first child grew, due to arrive before the summer's end. The past year had brought challenges, as any first year of marriage does. There had been adjustments for both of them. Faith learning to manage a ranch household, Preston learning to share decisions and space with a wife. There had been arguments about small things and a few about larger matters, but through it all, their love had only deepened, tempered by the everyday realities of building a life together. Preston spotted her waiting and urged Midnight to a trot, covering the remaining distance quickly. He dismounted with easy grace and bounded up the porch steps to embrace her, his hands gentle around her waist, mindful of her condition. "How are my two favorite people today?" he asked, placing a protective hand over hers on her belly. Faith smiled up at him. "We're well. Your son has been practicing his kicking all afternoon." "Or daughter," Preston reminded her, their ongoing gentle debate about the baby's gender, a familiar tease between them. "Or daughter," Faith conceded. "Either way, this child is strong and impatient to join us." Preston pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Just like their mother." Faith laughed and leaned into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather, pine, and the indefinable essence that was simply Preston. "Happy anniversary, my love," he murmured against her hair. "Happy anniversary," Faith replied, her heart full. "Can you believe it's been a year since our wedding day?" "The best year of my life," Preston said simply. Faith thought back to the stormy afternoon when she had been caught in the rain far from home, and the handsome cowboy who had ridden beside her until the sky cleared. How different her life might have been if Preston hadn't found her that day, if he hadn't offered shelter from the storm. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About fate," Faith answered. "About rainstorms and unexpected blessings." Preston smiled, understanding without needing more explanation. "I thank God every day for that storm," he said softly, "for bringing you into my life." Faith reached up to touch his cheek, still marveling sometimes that this good man was hers. "As do I." Together they stood on the porch of their home, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Before them stretched the Circle W, their legacy to the child who would soon join them, and perhaps to other children in the years to come. Behind them lay the path that had brought them together, a path marked by loss and courage, by chance meetings and deliberate choices, by love that had grown from a simple act of kindness during a prairie storm. As Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders, Faith knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, just as they had weathered that first storm side by side until the sky cleared.